There you go. Did anyone listen to Serial back in the day? That's good, because when Charlie did that, I said, I don't know if everyone's listened to Serial. Of course, Serial was the podcast that changed podcasting. Yet, really, podcasting started in 2004. Serial was published October 3, 2014, 10 years later. But in 2005, podcasting got its name from Ben Hammersley, the writer of The Guardian, who combined the words iPod and broadcasting. Now, isn't that interesting? How many people knew that? That's what I thought. Good information. 2005, Steve Jobs introduced the idea of subscribing to a podcast by building it into iTunes, and as we know, it's now a standard app in iPhones. 20 years later, 2024, 20 years later, things have changed quite a lot. We now have improved data, multiple distribution companies and platforms, a commercial marketplace that in 2017 in Australia didn't exist. We are now the leading world podcast consumption per capita. Australian audio media has done a brilliant job in leading the growth of podcasting, led by CRA and its members. Australia is one of the few English-speaking countries that has one agreed podcast ranker via Triton, ranked on monthly audience, and it now offers further insights via Demos Plus, a way that all advertisers can understand audience profiles of different genres. Having an agreed measurement standard for the industry has been an important step forward, and it really has been designed so that we can get rid of the confusion regarding audiences, especially for advertising buyers and sales teams. Whilst we still see some platforms making up their currency and metrics, the CRA Triton ranker has become the standard for the broader podcast industry in Australia to approved IAB standards. We've seen the profile of podcast audiences change over time. Whilst the need states have remained consistent, the audience profiles have changed, and we now know that blue-collar workers, for instance, are very big podcast listeners. A shift from the audience profile of the early adopters of podcasting. Today, podcasting appeals to people 16 to 70 years of age, with the sweet spot being Gen Z and millennials. As podcasting continues to grow at a rapid rate, reaching new audiences through new formats and genres, radio continues to do well, with both mediums attracting different audiences to cater to different audience needs. 31% of terrestrial radio listening is basically people who will also listen to a podcast. In other words, if you're going to offer advertisers an opportunity, you need both mediums. You need both radio, terrestrial radio, and podcasting to reach the new audiences. Whilst radio and podcasts are different, they're not each other's enemy. They're actually each other's best friend. The real thing that everyone is fighting for is attention. For advertisers, TV networks, social media, video streaming, and audio companies, we all need to gain and keep people's attention to drive action, to build relationships, trust and community around our brands, radio shows, podcasts, or platforms. We are all very much in the attention economy, and podcasting plays a key role because people make a conscious decision to listen. As we will hear, the notion of attention spans getting shorter due to social media isn't necessarily true, and podcasting changes this behaviour. To help me discuss the difference podcasts offer audiences and why it deserves to be a part of your media mix or your brand to gain the attention it deserves, please let me introduce the panel that we'll have a chat to today. Firstly, from 9 News, please welcome Jess Lodge. Jess is an award-winning journalist who has worked all around the world. Her passion is producing and storytelling. In 2023, Jess published her first podcast, Hannah's Story, which is now used by the Queensland and Victorian Police in their domestic violence and family violence training for officers. Please welcome Jess. Second up is Matt Thompson. Matt, of course, is a 9-wide World of Sports commentator across the National Rugby League, State of Origin, swimming and golf, as well as being a member of the highly successful continuous call team for 2GB, co-hosting a weekly NRL podcast with Phil Gould called Six Tackles with Gus Gould. Please welcome Matt. Our third panellist is Alexis Fernandez, host of Do You Effing, I'm not going to say it all, Effing Mind, not like those other hosts, podcast and author of the best-selling book Be Bold and the Neuroscience of Self-Love. Alexis is a Master of Neuroscience Alexis is passionate about helping people change their relationships with understanding how their brains work on a physical and chemical level and how it can be altered to change behaviour, thought patterns and habits. Please welcome Alexis. Our fourth panellist is Sam Koslowski, who is the co-host and co-founder of the Daily Aus. Sam's a lawyer turned media person who's worked on social media, innovation, is a refugee advocate and is a Movember community ambassador. The Daily Aus is Australia's leading social first news organisation targeted at young Australians, reaching over 1 million Australians per month across their podcast, newsletter and social media accounts. The podcast is created and co-hosted with Zara Seidler and published each weekday morning. Please welcome Sam. He's getting married on the weekend, by the way. Our fifth and final panellist is Matty Mills, co-host First Things First, a podcast series that with Brooke Blurton share their personal stories through a First Nation lens. Matty has worked for SBS and NITV. He is also a Deadly Award winner, an annual celebration of Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' achievements in music, sport, entertainment and community, and of course is an ACRA Award winner from last year's ACRAs. Matty recently joined the Nine Network's Getaway as the first Indigenous presenter, so please welcome Matty. So I'm going to get stuck in the nitty-gritty. It's a bit of an all-star panel, and each of this panel bring a certain difference about them. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask different questions so that each of them can give a perspective, and hopefully you're going to get some really good takeouts from it. First off to you, Alexis. You're a highly educated woman who's turned trusted audience right across the world. You had your 300th episode recently, which became quite emotional, which I'll ask you about. Can you talk to us about the relationship and the trust you have with that audience? And then secondly, why does podcasting change the attention span? So we'll kick off with that trusted audience and that moment when you had that hello moment with your listener.
Yeah, it was crazy. So I had my 300th episode on Friday, and my producer got all these listeners to send in these voice notes, but I hadn't heard them prior. So she's like, set up the camera, and I'm listening to all these voice notes. And then the stories that they were telling me was just incredible, and I'm crying as we're recording this podcast episode. But it was really cool to see, because from my perspective, I'm, speaking into the microphone a couple of times a week for the last nearly 4 years. And I rarely get to interact with my listeners, but from my listeners' perspective, they're saying, I've gone on this journey with you. I've gone through a divorce. You helped me leave this narcissist. I've gotten out of an abusive relationship. I've quit this job. All these huge decisions in their life, which of course it's them doing it, but they were saying, you gave me that push to do it. And so they're these people, and they say to me, I know you, even though you don't know me. And I feel like I do know my audience, because it's a kind of person. My audience is a kind of person, and I know them very well, but I know what they mean in that sense. So like, you're the sister that I've never had. You're that person who's giving me the kick up the ass when I need it, but you're nurturing. You care about me. It's not this tough love where it's just really harsh and brutal. It's this, you're going on this journey with me. So I really, really can resonate with my audience when they say that we've gone on this 4 years. For some people, they've been listening since day one, and we've gone on this long journey together. And I think that's very different to, for example, social media and things like that, because they're listening to you. I'm also sharing longer stories about my life, where I'm also sharing listener stories as well. So it's not just their relationship with me, but it's their relationship with each other, because we've created a community on top of that. So it's pretty special.
So we were talking about, there's a whole big thing about short span, attention spans getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And we had the discussion about it's more the format that you're delivering. Do you want to talk to a bit of that from a more neuroscience point of view?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's this belief that our attention spans are, shot to pieces and all of that. But it's more so in the context. So if you are on TikTok or on Instagram and you're watching 15-second videos back to back, if something comes up that's an hour, you're thinking, oh, no, I'm just doing this while I'm sipping on my coffee. I'm not going to dedicate that time to that. So it's very much, it's not really a choice. You're not choosing what content you're consuming to an extent. It's kind of just being presented to you. And because you're expecting it to be 15 seconds, 30 seconds, you don't want any more than that. However, the antidote to poor attention span is interest. And we all know what it's like to be interested in something. How many of us have binged a Netflix series or are into podcasts. You know, when I first started the podcast, I thought, oh, is 50 minutes too long for an episode? And then a couple of times I was really rushed and I'd deliver a 30-minute episode, and the complaints that I got from people, they're like, why is it shorter? What, you've robbed us. And I think it comes down to this fact that attention, we all have it, but we have to be interested. And if you can captivate an audience, if they care, and on top of that, if they are choosing to engage with your content, they're actively going, they're looking for you, they're selecting it, they're like, that topic I really need to hear, then they're going to engage for as long as they need to engage, you know? And for a lot of people, I mean, look at Huberman Lab, who I love. Some of his episodes are 3 hours long, and I'll listen to the whole thing. So it's a lie that we don't have the attention span. We just have to look at it in the sense of what is the environment that the person is consuming this content. Because when you look at great TV series, when you look at great films, when you go to the cinema, you can't even move out of your chair and you're there for hours. So it's really interesting to I don't know, I just think that it's a bit of a myth that we just can't pay attention anymore. I don't think that's true.
Thanks, Alexis. Sam, one for you. So social media, we were just talking about social media, plays a role in your business. And as we know, more and more influencers are turning to podcasting as an extension to engage their communities in a different way. Why is your podcast so important in engaging a different audience? Because you do have two very different approaches. So can you talk us through where podcasting sits compared to social media?
Yeah, so we, the Daily Aus started as an Instagram page 6 years ago. I was a lawyer, Zara was in politics, and we literally just started a single page. It took us 3 years to get our first 5,000 followers, 2.5 years, and then when the pandemic kicked off, we just kind of exploded. We'd do these case number tallies at 11 a.m. And we've now got 525,000 on Instagram. We're the second biggest news page on Instagram in the country behind the ABC. So that was our core audience to begin with. But then when we quit our jobs, got a team around us, we started to diversify, and podcast was the first thing that we diversified into. And it really has brought an extra layer to the company, but it's a pure multi-platform approach. So we treat our reader or listener as the same person. Our podcast listener is not different to our social media follower. They follow us on Instagram, then they read the newsletter, then they listen to the podcast, then they watch a video, then they're on TikTok. And we try and build that sort of habit-forming behavior throughout the day with them. So we know that people are listening to the podcast first thing in the morning. So then we'll focus our Instagram story work in the afternoons and refer back to that in the podcast or in the Instagram story. So we're really trying to track them throughout their day. To Alexis's point, though, about the emotional connection, it was really interesting. We launched a book last year, and Zara and I very consciously haven't put ourselves out there too much as like the faces of the company. We didn't have bylines in our pieces for the first 5 years. The logo on Instagram was never ours. We weren't influencers in that way. Most people didn't know who we were, which was great. That's the point. We wanted people to trust the brand. Yep. But then when we were signing books at the book launch, everyone in the line, or 90% of people in the line, were saying, I love your podcast. And that was really interesting because social media is our biggest audience. The newsletter is massive as well. But it was the podcast that people really felt like they were coming to see Sam and Zara, which was quite special.
I guess, Sam, what you're saying is that while all these other mediums are important to have connection points, podcasting does allow that more intimate authenticity that you can create, that you can't create through other mediums.
But also, if you then use all those platforms together, you unlock like expert level. And it's this whole new world of engagement. So we'll say to people on our podcast, head to our Instagram story, there's a poll up there, let us know what you think, and we'll talk about it with you tomorrow. Yep. And you're like, and especially from a brand perspective, if you can work out how to do a campaign really effectively, where you've got newsletter content that relates to what's happening in the podcast, and then podcast content that's relating to a video product on Instagram, you literally can maximize your touch points with that audience. I mean, we just did that we just did a big partnership with the Australian Open and kind of did some of that throughout all the different platforms. And it really, really worked. You know, sometimes we pick one product as the core of that campaign. And so if the podcast is the core of that campaign, we'll put snippets up of that campaign on TikTok or Instagram or in the newsletter and circle it all back. And that's like pro level what the kids are doing.
All right, I like the term pro level, don't you? I love it. Thanks, Sam. Matt, for you, radio podcasting is a key part of the podcast landscape, as we know, and allows radio teams to connect with audiences in a different way. Besides your podcast with Gus Gould, you've also created podcast docu-series, NRL Origin and The Road to Paris, of course, coming into the Olympics. Tell us about the different podcast formats and how they vary, because you do live TV as well, and also radio. So what's different for you? And you talked really passionately about those docu-series and why you love being a part of those. Can you talk to us through that and why they're so important in storytelling?
Well, it's a vastly different style of broadcasting, but in the end, in sport where I work in, it comes back to the stories at the core of sport, and sport is emotive. And my experience, and a little bit of what Alexis said there too, I can almost take it a step further. When someone opens a podcast app and selects a podcast, they're actually asking to be engaged. And my experience with the longer form podcast that I've been fortunate to work on, Stories of Origin, which actually won an ACRA for its production last year, and Road to Paris, which comes out next month. These are the most compelling sporting stories produced in a manner where they're essentially an event within themselves.
Yep.
And to me, really, podcasting is the only vehicle left where these long-form, documentary-style, emotive episodes can exist anymore because of time constraints in traditional media. So that's why I love making them. And I think the whole idea that people are asking to be invested in what you're doing, it's really powerful from a content creation point of view, but also from a commercialisation point of view.
Yeah. Talk to me more about how you approach advertising and everything else within that environment, and why does that feel important to you as a guy who's creating these longer form podcasts?
Yeah, well, look, the Six Tackles with Gus podcast is a complete opposite to the long form stuff. It's very raw. It's essentially based on personalities and relationships and the people that listen. We've got a rusted on audience for a podcast which has been going for 8 years now.
Yep.
And we've had over 3 million downloads. So people feel like they're actually part of it.
Yep.
So from a commercialisation perspective, I think that's really valuable. But leading into Paris, Olympic stories are going to be what people are seeking, and hopefully we can tell some really good ones. With respect to that captivating storytelling, this obviously launched next month, but the thing I love about it is the deep dive, the being able to go behind the story. I'm sure Jess will talk a bit more about that as well. But talking with the best of the best and actually delving into the story behind the story, I think that's what engages people. So that's what I love about being able to do it. And I think that's where the value comes in terms of engagement and commercialisation.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, mate. Matty, down the end now. You're an actor, you do TV, and you also do audio. In relation to your podcast, which is a very special podcast to you, what does it allow you to do that other mediums don't? And you do stage the whole shebang. So can you tell us a little bit why the podcast becomes important to you?
Yeah, I think the podcast allows me to be myself. There's a very authentic voice that is coming from my heart when I'm on that platform. I think across the board in terms of my career, there's specific versions of myself that I put into play for different aspects to my career, but my podcast, I feel like I'm most myself. And I think that it is a place where authenticity is, received extremely well. I find that my podcast with Brooke Blurton, it's called First Things First. It is a podcast where we are demystifying what it means to be a First Nations person in this country and demystifying those stereotypes that have been put in place for years. And this last year I won an ACRA award for Best New Talent for Podcast, and it was on the night that the Voice referendum actually didn't go through. So for me, this podcast platform is a place where I can use my voice as a First Nations person and I can cut through it. We have an incredible audience that are learning, educating themselves and jumping on board, as our listeners to learn more about who we are as people in this country and how important it is for podcasting to be a diverse place, not just of skills and of stories, but of backgrounds. And I believe that podcasting does that pretty well in this country, especially when you consider other audio elements in our country. I think podcasting is leading in diversity when it comes to stories being told, but there's always room for improvement. And I feel like at the heart of my podcast on Nova, that's what we're pushing, and that's why I find that being authentic is the key there.
Fantastic. A question though, do you, and this might be a loaded question to you without notice, but you talked openly about we're diverse enough Do you get enough commercial support for your diversity? I mean, do you think that for our agencies and advertisers in the room that they're actually coming to put money into this work, which is so important to tell of the complete diversity of our culture in Australia? Do you think they're getting enough support?
I think that for Brooke Blurton and I, we are two First Nations people who are actually seen as an asset to the Nova Network. I think that we do well commercially when it comes to sales and when it comes to brands wanting to sponsor our podcast. And I think that was an eye-opener for Brooke and I, actually, because unfortunately we haven't seen representation in this field enough to feel like we are valued. But behind the scenes, we absolutely are. And brands do want to partner with us. They do want to lend their sponsorship money to, First Nations voices and people who are, from diverse backgrounds. So I think behind the scenes, but, maybe to an audience perspective, they wouldn't know that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Jess, I'm going to move on to you. Fantastic podcast, Hannah's Story. I mean, the fact you must be delighted that the Queensland Police and the Vic Police use this for training. Talk to us about that a little bit, and I'm going to ask you another question about, you are a journalist and you use this as a powerful tool. I'll talk to you about that afterwards. So tell us a little bit about how you felt about that in creating Hannah's Story.
Yeah, I think whenever we tell a story, we hope that it's going to resonate and cut through and reach a really wide audience. And this one already had such a big audience before we got to retell it in a podcast format. For those people in the audience who don't know the name Hannah Clark, Hannah and her 3 beautiful children were murdered by her estranged partner. So it was one of those cases that really just grabbed the attention of Australians, and building on that, they wanted to know more. They wanted to know why. There were so many questions. The podcast allowed us to dive through 6+ hours of audio of really confronting material, but people wanted to hear it. And then for it to then be used not just as a way to tell a really terrible story, but as a tool for education. That was the goal from the beginning. When I sat down with her parents, Sue and Lloyd, it was, we don't just want to say what happened, we want to say how and what can we do to change. And we did that, and now it's, the proof's in the pudding. So yeah, it's being used also in education programs for businesses and schools, and like you said, with the police. So I think it just shows the power of podcasting, of journalism, of storytelling, in education and in conversation. The conversation out there in the community off the back of it was amazing. So
we've actually seen a bit of a twist, haven't we? Because journalism's become quite short form to a lot of different mediums, and there's this real movement at the moment, and I certainly know from our point of view, around really investigative journalism, which has a story to tell that needs to be told. Where do you see it heading in that regard, from a journalistic point of view?
I mean, there's clearly an appetite for true crime specifically. Yeah. Everybody knows that. But I think it's more the quality of what we need to be putting out there. Yeah. And I think that came through with this. You can see it in the comments and the feedback we had. It was how the story is told. It's not about the story. It's about how you approach it, the sensitivity, and again, the education. And I think there's an opportunity here to, in podcasting, dive into topics that otherwise can't be reached. Yep. On television, my day-to-day is in TV news. We've got 1.5 minutes to tell a story. It is not long. And when you've got the podcast, you've got that direct audience. They're there for that story. They want to hear it. And you have the opportunity to dive into the confronting material really sensitively, really deeply, that other traditional media just can't do. And Hannah's Story was a great example of that. Yeah.
We got another one in the pipeline?
I do have another one in the pipeline.
Can you give us a clue?
I can't give you a clue, but it's quite different.
Okay.
So
in what way?
Space.
Quite different.
In the formatting of it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. It will be. I'll give you a clue. It will be covering a trial in a way. Yeah. In a way that I think we haven't explored too much in Australia in terms of covering live trials through podcasts because of the legal limitations. Yep. But we're going to see if we can push the boundaries a little bit.
Fantastic. Yep. Thank you. So as you can see, we've got five people doing very different things with their different skills. And I think the beauty of podcasting is that we start with a blank canvas. Every time we go into a studio, we start with a blank canvas. The great thing is we have more and more information and data now about understanding the audiences that we're talking to. So if you think we're back in 2004 or 2010 with Serial, move on. The world has changed quite dramatically. I know how much work goes into these. Alexis is educating and changing people's lives. We've got Sam, who is actually becoming a part of a daily routine across all of his touch points. Matty is educating us, white Australia, about First Nations and actually having an opportunity to go and do things. We've got sports stories, which are the heart of Australia, and we've got investigative journalism. I think podcasting is in a great place. It's personal, it's authentic, it is candid. And we ask that you give it the time as advertisers to come into the medium, let it do what it does best, and that's communicate your message in a trusted environment. And I'd like you to thank all of our panel for here today. Thank you. Thanks.